She had 43 days to save everything she'd spent a decade building. Not from a competitor, not from a market crash. From a single paragraph buried in a document her father wrote before she was old enough to run a company. A clause she never knew existed until a board member who smiled at her every Monday morning handed her the paper with barely concealed satisfaction. Vanessa Sterling had survived worse, or at least she thought she had. She was about to find out that sometimes the most dangerous threats don't arrive with warning. They arrive with a briefcase, a polished smile, and a timestamp that's already running. If this is your kind of story, the kind where everything falls apart before it gets better, hit that like button right now and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The Pacific was doing what it always did, performing. White foam, blue-gray water, horizon that looked painted. Vanessa had stopped noticing it 2 days ago, which was the first sign she was more stressed than she was willing to admit. Beautiful scenery only registered when you had bandwidth for it. Right now, she had none. The Meridian Executive Retreat occupied 40 acres of Carmel coastline that technically existed for the purpose of strategic alignment and leadership bonding. In practice, it was the place where Viridian Technologies held its annual 4-day event where department heads drank overpriced wine, argued about Q3 projections in rooms with ocean views, and convinced themselves that the catered lunches and sunset paddleboard sessions were legitimate business expenses. Vanessa had built this tradition herself 5 years ago. She'd always believed that people worked better when they felt trusted, and that trust didn't come from a downtown conference room. Now she was beginning to wonder what she'd been thinking. It was day 2 of the retreat, just after 8 in the morning, and she was standing on the private deck attached to the main executive suite, her suite, holding a mug of coffee she hadn't drunk and staring at the water like it owed her something. Behind her, through the glass doors, she could hear the faint sounds of the property coming to life. A cart rolling across stone, someone laughing down the hall, the smell of whatever the kitchen was doing with butter and herbs. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from her executive assistant, Diane. Richard is asking if you received his correspondence. He said he sent it yesterday evening. Vanessa set the coffee down on the railing. Richard Holloway had been on the Viridian board for 3 years. He'd come in as a respected operations voice, a seasoned executive with a long resume in enterprise tech, and a network that ran 3 levels deep through California's corporate establishment. He was 61, measured in everything he said, and he had this particular way of watching a room that Vanessa had never entirely trusted. Not dislike. She didn't have anything concrete to base dislike on, just a gut read she'd never been able to shake. He'd sent her an email at 11:47 p.m. the night before. She'd seen it arrive on her phone but hadn't opened it, which she now recognized as some instinct trying to protect her from whatever was in it. She went inside, sat at the small desk, and opened her laptop. The email was 4 paragraphs long, professionally written, and attached to it was a scanned document, 31 pages, lightly yellowed at the edges in the scan, old ink on old paper. A founding governance document. She recognized the structure, the formatting, the particular legalese of the era, her father's era. Marcus Sterling had founded Viridian 17 years ago, when Vanessa was 13. He'd run it for 9 years before his heart gave out. Suddenly, one Tuesday afternoon in his own office, 48 hours after his last board meeting. Vanessa had taken over at 22, 6 months into her last year at Stanford, with a legal team she didn't fully understand and a board that wasn't sure what to make of her. She'd spent the better part of 8 years making them understand. The document was the original Articles of Governance. She'd read it, or a version of it, years ago. She'd had lawyers review it when she formally assumed control. She thought she knew what was in it. She hadn't known about Section 14C. It took her 10 minutes to find it in the scan, buried between a shareholder rights provision and a clause about quorum requirements for emergency meetings. It was 4 sentences long. Her father had apparently added it as part of a broader governance amendment in his 7th year running the company, motivated by, according to Richard's email, by a concern about leadership stability and the risk of a sole controlling shareholder operating without what the document called a legally recognized partner structure. The language was vague enough to be almost academic. A partner structure. The clause didn't specify what kind, it didn't define the nature of the relationship, but it did specify 2 things with complete clarity. First, that any controlling shareholder who had exercised governance authority for more than 7 consecutive years without satisfying the requirement could be subject to a temporary transfer of executive voting rights to the board. And second, that the board could invoke that provision by a 2/3 majority vote. Vanessa had been in executive control for 8 years and 4 months. She read the clause 3 times. Then she read Richard's email again, slowly. He wasn't asking a question, he was informing her. He was telling her, in the polished language of a man who'd thought carefully about how to phrase things, that he intended to raise a motion at the next full board session, which was scheduled for 6 weeks from Thursday, to invoke the provision of Section 14C and request a temporary transfer of executive governance rights pending Vanessa's compliance or the board's determination of an alternate path forward. He called it a matter of fiduciary stewardship. Vanessa closed the laptop. She sat for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Marcus Chen. Marcus was her general counsel, not the external firm, not outside litigators, but her in-house GC who'd been with her for 6 years and who she trusted more than almost anyone on the legal side of her life. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd already seen the email too. "Tell me you're not reading what I'm reading," she said. "I've had it for 40 minutes. His voice was careful. "I'm already on it." "How real is this?" "Real enough that we're taking it seriously." He paused. "The clause is legitimate. I verified the document provenance. It was filed and registered. It's part of the original governance package. We don't have a challenge on authenticity. My father put this in there." "It looks that way." Vanessa stood up and walked back to the deck. The Pacific was still performing. "So what do we do?" "We need to understand what satisfies it," Marcus said. "The language is broad, legally recognized partner structure. That phrase is doing a lot of work. It might mean something narrower than it sounds, or it might not. I need my team on this today." "But Vanessa, the more immediate concern is the board vote. If Richard can get to a 2/3 majority, he can't. I have 5 reliable votes. You have 5 votes on ordinary matters. If he frames this as fiduciary responsibility, as protecting shareholder interests, as simply enforcing an existing governance provision that you may have technically been out of compliance with," Marcus stopped. "It gets complicated. People who vote with you on business decisions might not want to be seen voting against the enforcement of a governance clause. That's a different conversation." She understood what he wasn't quite saying. This wasn't about whether the board liked Richard better than her. It was about whether board members who were fundamentally on her side would feel they had cover to block the invocation of a written governance rule that had been sitting in the founding documents for 11 years. The answer was probably no. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks to either satisfy the clause or find a way to challenge it, or convince the board not to vote for it. Yes. Vanessa looked at the water. A pelican was working the surface maybe 40 yards out, diving and missing, patient or just stubborn. Hard to tell. "Get everyone working," she said. "I want options by end of day." The retreat continued because she made it continue. She attended the 9 o'clock strategy session. She asked good questions about the new enterprise client pipeline. She ate lunch at the communal table with 4 department heads and talked about the Seattle expansion plans, and didn't let her face do anything it wasn't supposed to do. This was a skill she'd developed in her 20s, under pressure, in rooms full of people who would have used any visible crack against her. You learned to keep the surface still, even when everything underneath was moving fast. But she was also watching the room differently now. Richard Holloway arrived at the 11 o'clock session looking exactly like he always looked. Trim, calm, wearing the kind of suit that didn't call attention to itself. He greeted people by name. He asked someone's assistant how her mother was doing. He poured himself coffee and sat 3 seats down from Vanessa and made a point of making brief, ordinary eye contact with her, just enough to establish that nothing unusual was happening. She'd seen this move before, in negotiations. The person who's already made their play acting like it's any other day. It was supposed to create uncertainty in you, make you question whether you'd misread things. It didn't work on her. What she did notice, and filed away, was that Richard had a brief exchange with 2 board members just before the session started, Davis Yee and Carolyn Marsh, both of whom ran smaller tech investment funds, and both of whom had historically voted on the moderate center of whatever issue was in front of them. The exchange lasted maybe 90 seconds. Friendly. Richard made a quiet joke. Both of them laughed. 90 seconds was enough to plant something. After lunch, Vanessa's phone lit up with a text from Marcus. Free in 30? She stepped out of the afternoon networking session, which she normally ran, and handed it off to her COO with a vague mention of a legal call she needed to take. She walked to the east side of the property, where there was a garden path between sculpted hedges that nobody used during business hours. And she called Marcus back. Okay, he said. Here's where we are. The clause is enforceable. We've looked at challenge angles. The best argument we have is that the language is ambiguous and a court might define partner structure differently than Richard's interpretation would require. But that route takes time we don't have, and there's no guarantee a judge rules our way before the board votes. So we satisfy the clause. That's option 2. The question is how. If the intent was a romantic partnership, a spouse, essentially, then Vanessa, 6 weeks isn't, what does the actual language say? That's the thing. She could hear him turning pages. It says legally recognized partner structure, not spouse, not domestic partner, not romantic relationship, partner structure. And there's a cross-reference to the state commercial code definition, which is broader, much broader. A commercial partnership, a legal co-guardian arrangement, even certain documented personal partnership frameworks could potentially qualify. If we argue the clause in its most literal construction, we have more options than Richard probably intends us to have. Vanessa stopped walking. A gull passed overhead and was gone. You're telling me this doesn't necessarily require a marriage. I'm telling you it might not. But we'd need a structure that holds up to scrutiny, board scrutiny, legal scrutiny, and potentially public scrutiny if this gets out. Whatever we do, it needs to be airtight. No gray areas. Nothing that looks like we're gaming the clause, because if it looks like maneuvering, that plays right into Richard's framing. Who knows about this besides you? My team, 4 people. Keep it contained. I don't want Richard knowing we're moving until we have something concrete. She paused. Put together a framework of options, every legitimate structure that might qualify. I want to see them tonight. I'll have something to you by 8. She stayed on the path for a few minutes after hanging up, standing between the hedges with the sun on her face and her mind running fast. She was 30 years old. She'd built Viridian from a 12-person startup she'd inherited at 22 into a $2 billion company with 400 employees and a patent portfolio that was the spine of everything she'd constructed. She'd done it by being smarter and more prepared than the people trying to stop her, and by understanding one thing about power. It wasn't what you had, it was what you could defend. She needed to defend this. The legal team's options document arrived at 7:52 p.m., 8 pages. 6 structural scenarios, ranging from the obviously unworkable to 2 that Marcus had highlighted in green as potentially viable, pending deeper analysis. She read it in her suite while the rest of the retreat's attendees were at the dinner event 2 buildings away, and she was still reading when her phone buzzed with a message she hadn't expected. Ethan Parker, 7:58 p.m. Ms. Sterling, I know this is outside normal channels. I've read the Section 14C documentation. I think I may have found something. If you have 10 minutes tonight, I'd like to walk you through it. She stared at the message. Ethan Parker was Viridian's lead IP attorney, intellectual property, not corporate governance. He'd been with the company for 4 years, came from a boutique firm that specialized in technology patent law and had won 2 significant litigation cases for them in the past 18 months that had protected a combined $400 million in patent value. He was good at his job. She'd noticed that without necessarily paying much attention to him as a person. She knew, because the HR files passed across her desk once a year, that he was a single father. His daughter was, she thought, around 6 or 7. She couldn't remember how he'd ended up on his own. It wasn't the kind of detail she'd retained. She hadn't sent him any documents, which meant he'd found out about Section 14C some other way. How did you get this? She typed back. Marcus's team pinged IP for a patent clause review. I was already in the governance document for a different reason. We're defending a trade secret claim that touches some of the original charter language. I wasn't looking for 14C, but I found it. She considered that for a moment. It tracked. My sweet, give me 15 minutes. He knocked at 8:19. She opened the door and got her first real look at Ethan Parker as someone she was about to have a serious conversation with rather than a name on a case update. He was taller than she'd registered. She mostly saw him across conference rooms, with the slightly worn look of someone who was running on adequate rather than sufficient sleep. He was carrying a laptop and a legal pad, and he was already in professional mode before she'd said a word, which she appreciated. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. "Come in." He set his things on the small table and didn't waste time. "I want to be upfront about something first. I'm not sure whether going around Marcus Chen is the right move here, and I want you to know I'm not trying to position myself or create an angle. What I found, I think Marcus's team would eventually find, but I don't think they're looking in the right place yet." "Okay." She sat across from him. "Show me." He opened his laptop. The document cross-references California Civil Code Section 16,101, which is commercial partnership definitions. Marcus's team flagged that. But there's a secondary cross-reference that's easy to miss. A 1987 state statute about formal co-guardianship and legal co-custody declarations. It's rarely invoked anymore because family law has evolved, but it was part of the legal landscape when your father wrote this. And that statute defines a legally recognized partnership structure in a way that's broader than anything in the commercial code. He turned the laptop so she could see the screen. He'd highlighted 2 paragraphs. She read them. Then she read them again. "This covers a formal legal co-parenting declaration," she said slowly. "Among other things, if a party enters into a formally declared, legally documented co-parenting or co-guardian arrangement, one that is publicly registered, legally binding, and involves a co-equal partner, it technically satisfies the language of 14C under the original statutory reference framework." He paused. "I'm not saying it's bulletproof. I'm saying it's a legitimate legal structure that exists within the parameters the clause itself defines." Vanessa looked at him. He was looking back at her with the careful expression of someone who understood exactly what he'd just said. "You're proposing something." "I'm identifying an option," he said carefully. "I'm an IP attorney. This isn't my practice area, but the structure exists, and it could be built in a way that satisfies the clause without giving any individual party control, financial interest, or governance rights they wouldn't otherwise have. Every element would be disclosed. Full transparency with the board, the compliance team, and external counsel, the whole arrangement designed to be reviewable. That structure would require a real person." She kept her voice level. "Someone with something to lose." "Yes. And you're telling me about it at 8 in the evening in my hotel suite." He didn't look away. "I'm telling you about it because I found it and you need to know. What you do with it is your call. I want to be very clear. I'm not pitching myself. I'm giving you information." She studied him for a moment. The legal pad in front of him had notes in small, tight handwriting. Not the scatter of someone working too fast, but the organized shorthand of someone who thought structurally. He'd done real work before coming up here. He'd mapped this out. "Who else knows you found this?" she asked. "No one." "Why did you come to me directly instead of Marcus?" He seemed to weigh that. "Because it's your company and your decision. Marcus will filter it. He'll present you with a risk-adjusted summary. I wanted you to see the actual structure before it got translated." That was a real answer. She filed it. "Leave me your notes," she said. "I'll have Marcus's team review it in the morning. Don't discuss this with anyone tonight." "Of course." He closed his laptop and picked up the legal pad, then set it back down. "One more thing. My daughter is 7. Her name is Sophie. I raise her alone, and she's why every decision I make at this company matters to me. I'm not telling you that to build sympathy. I'm telling you because if this option goes anywhere, you deserve to know who you'd be dealing with, and that's the most important fact about me." He stood. "Good night, Ms. Sterling." He left. Vanessa sat at the table for a while after the door closed. She looked at the legal pad. His handwriting really was very organized. Outside, the Pacific was doing its thing in the dark. She couldn't see it, but she could hear it, the low, ongoing sound of water against the coast, indifferent and patient. She pulled the legal pad toward her and started reading his notes from the beginning. The next morning was the last morning of the retreat, and everyone was in the light mood that came with knowing you were going home. Bags in the lobby by 10, checkout by 11, a final collective breakfast that felt more social than professional. Vanessa moved through it on autopilot, smiling at the right moments and engaging in the right conversations while the part of her brain that mattered was already 3 moves ahead. She caught Ethan at the coffee station at 7:45 before the group breakfast began. He was filling a travel mug. He had that slightly before everyone else energy of someone who needed to be packed and ready ahead of schedule, probably because he had a kid to get home to. "The notes were good," she said quietly without preamble. "Marcus is reviewing the full statutory chain this morning. I need you on a call with the governance team at 2. He nodded once. "I'll be there." "One question." She kept her voice low, not because she thought anyone was listening, but because the question deserved that. "If this becomes a viable option, the structure you described, and if the person who entered into it did so in good faith, put their professional standing on the line for it, followed every rule and had every document in order, what would they get out of it?" Ethan looked at her for a moment. He didn't pretend to misunderstand the question. "Nothing they didn't already have." She looked at him a second longer, then she picked up her coffee and went to find Marcus. Bob, 3 time zones away, in a Chicago office suite that Vanessa had never been in and hopefully never would be, a man named Gerald Tate was on a call with Richard Holloway. Tate ran a private equity operation called Meridian Capital Group. Not the retreat, different Meridian, a coincidence that nobody had bothered to find amusing. His fund had been acquiring technology companies for 11 years, specifically the kind of technology companies that had built valuable IP portfolios and whose founders were no longer around or no longer in control. He was good at it. The model was simple. Find a company with assets worth more than its operating value, remove the leadership that understood the actual product, sell off the patent portfolio to the highest bidder among 6 defense contractors and platform enterprises, and exit in 3 years or fewer. Viridian Technologies had been on his radar for 2 years. "The board motion is filed," Richard said. 6 weeks to the vote. She knows. How'd she take it? Like she always takes things. Kept moving. Didn't show anything. A pause. "But she'll be moving fast. She's not someone who freezes." "That's fine. She doesn't have a lot of options." Tate leaned back in his chair. "What's your count on the board?" "Conservative estimate, 7. Enough." "What about the others?" "Watkins and Osei will abstain if we frame it right. Park and DeLuca might hold for her, but they won't be enough." Richard paused again. "The weak point is the legal angle. If her team finds a way to satisfy the clause, 6 weeks isn't enough time to manufacture a real partnership structure." "No, it isn't." Tate looked at the window. His Chicago view was all glass and steel and sky, which he'd always preferred to the ocean. Water was too variable. Glass and steel stayed where you put them. "Keep me updated," he said. "And Richard, if anything starts moving on the legal side that looks real, I want to know immediately." "Of course." The call ended. In California, Vanessa Sterling's car was pulling out of the resort property, Marcus Chen's number already dialing on her phone. 41 days on the clock, she couldn't see but could feel with everything she had. Bam. The offices of Viridian Technologies occupied 6 floors of a glass building in Palo Alto that Vanessa had chosen specifically because of the light. She'd never been able to articulate that to anyone in a way that sounded like a business decision, so she justified it on lease terms and parking. But the light had been real. The way the California morning came through the south-facing glass and hit the open floor plan in a way that made the space feel honest, like it had nothing to hide. She was back in the building by 4 in the afternoon, having driven straight from Carmel, and by 4:30 she was in the 8th floor conference room with Marcus Chen, 2 members of his governance team, Ethan Parker, and an outside consultant Marcus had pulled in on 3 hours' notice, a woman named Diane Ashworth, who specialized in governance litigation and who had, as Marcus put it, seen more creative use of founding documents than anyone else in the state. Diane Ashworth was 60, direct, and had the courtroom lawyer's quality of listening to you the way a surgeon listens to a patient, looking for things you didn't mean to reveal. She'd read the Ethan's statutory analysis on the drive up from San Jose. "It's coherent," she said, which from her tone appeared to be high praise. "The 1987 statute is real, it's active, and the cross-reference is embedded in the original governance language in a way that creates a legitimate pathway. The question isn't whether the structure exists. The question is whether it holds up to a board that's being steered toward a predetermined conclusion." "Richard will challenge it," Marcus said. "Of course he will. So we build it in a way that survives challenge." She looked at Vanessa. "What's your actual situation? Personal, not legal?" Vanessa didn't love the question, but she understood it. "I don't have a partner. I'm not in any relationship. I haven't been in anything serious for 2 years. And under this structure, you wouldn't need to be." Diane looked at Ethan. "Mr. Parker, you proposed this. Walk me through the personal side of it." Ethan kept his voice steady. "I'm a single parent. My daughter is 7. I have full custody. Her mother is not in the picture. A formal co-parenting declaration would be a real legal instrument, not a fiction. It would create actual legal rights and responsibilities, and it would need to be treated as such. I'm not proposing a paper arrangement. I'm proposing a real one, with every disclosure in place, every conflict of interest documented, every financial arrangement between us, which would be 0, verified." "Your law license," Diane said, "is something I've thought about. If this gets challenged and the ethics board determines it was an attempt to manipulate corporate governance, then I lose it," he said. "I understand that." A beat of quiet settled over the table. Vanessa looked at him. He was looking at Diane, not at her, and his expression was the same careful, controlled thing it had been in her hotel suite the night before. Someone who'd already worked through the risk assessment in private and was now presenting the output. She thought about what he'd said about his daughter, the way he'd said it. Not as a bargaining chip, more like making sure she had the full picture. "Let me ask a different question," Vanessa said. She looked around the table. "Is there any other option, any other structure we haven't looked at, that satisfies the clause without requiring someone to stake their career on it?" Silence. "Marcus, we've gone through 6 scenarios." He shook his head. "The commercial partnership routes don't hold up because they require a financial structure, and any financial entanglement between you and a partner would create a conflict of interest problem with the board. The co-guardianship statute is the only pathway that's both real and clean. Clean meaning Ethan's name would be on a legal document with mine. Clean meaning it would withstand scrutiny because it's genuinely what it says it is." Vanessa turned back to Ethan. "You have a 7-year-old. Sophie," he said. "Yes." "If this goes forward and it gets ugly, and Richard will make it ugly, your daughter gets pulled into a public mess. Your career is on the line. Your income is on the line." "Yes." "Why would you do that?" He was quiet for a second. Not the quiet of someone who didn't have an answer, but the quiet of someone choosing which true answer to give. "Because I looked at the structure and it's legitimate, and it protects what this company has built. And I think what this company has built matters. The patents in our portfolio, the work we've done in accessible technology infrastructure, that's real. If Richard Holloway sells this to Meridian Capital, it gets stripped and sold, and the product that 400 people built disappears. I've been part of building it. I don't want to watch that happen because I stayed on the sidelines." Diane Ashworth made a small sound that wasn't quite anything, but that Vanessa read as something. "All right," Vanessa said. She sat up a little straighter. "Diane, I want a full risk analysis on the structure by Friday. Marcus, I want compliance briefed. Nothing moves forward without every box checked, every document reviewed by outside counsel, and a full disclosure package ready for the board before we file anything." She looked at Ethan. "And you talk to a personal attorney. Not ours. Yours. Someone who represents only you. Before you sign anything, before you agree to anything, you have independent counsel review the entire arrangement. That's not optional." "Understood," he said. "Good." She stood, which signaled the end. People started gathering their things. "One more thing. Nobody outside this room talks about this. Not to spouses, not to colleagues, not to anyone. Richard has ears in this building, and I'm not giving him a head start." People nodded. The meeting broke. As the room cleared, Vanessa stayed at the window. The evening light was doing its thing with the building glass, that honest California gold that would be gone in 20 minutes. She watched it. 40 days. She'd built an entire company in less time than that once. She'd closed a financing round in 12 days when the previous investor pulled out, and everyone said it was over. She'd hired a 40-person team in 6 weeks when a competitor tried to poach half her engineering department. She could do this. She had to. Ethan Parker left the building at 6:15 and drove the 20 minutes back to his house in Redwood City. The house was a 3-bedroom bungalow on a street that still had old oak trees that they apparently didn't have the budget to uproot for the newer developments. He'd bought it 3 years ago when he moved to Viridian, paid more than he was comfortable with, and had not once regretted it because Sophie loved the oak trees. She was at the kitchen table when he came in, doing homework that was apparently frustrating her based on the angle of her pencil. Their neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, who watched Sophie on late office days and asked nothing in return except a standing invitation to holiday dinners, was washing something at the sink. "Dad," Sophie said without looking up, "long division is a problem and I have questions." "I'll be right there," he said. "Let me put my bag down, Mrs." Kowalski gave him a look that conveyed a mild afternoon had occurred, handed him Sophie's snack plate to finish, and let herself out. Ethan sat down across from his daughter. Sophie was 7 with an opinion about everything and a filing system in her mind that occasionally produced non sequiturs at 8 p.m. about something he'd said 3 weeks ago that she had been quietly processing. She had his eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and he had long since made peace with both of those things. He helped her with the long division. He made dinner. He read to her for 20 minutes before she told him she was old enough to read herself, which he knew but had been hoping to get another few weeks out of. He sat on the edge of her bed after the light was out and listened to the particular quality of the dark that came with a kid in the house, different from any other silence he'd ever known. 40 days, he thought. He hadn't told her anything, and he wouldn't. Not yet. Maybe not at all, depending on how it went. But sitting there in the dark at the edge of her bed, with the oak trees doing their thing outside the window and Sophie's breathing settling into the easy rhythm of sleep, he thought about what Vanessa Sterling had asked him. Why would you do that? He'd given her the professional answer because it was true. But there was another truth underneath it, the kind that doesn't get said in conference rooms. He'd spent 4 years at Viridian because the work meant something, not to him in some abstract ideological sense, but in the concrete way that good work means something, in the satisfying weight of a case well argued, in the particular cleanness of a structure built right. He was good at his job. He'd built something there, and he wasn't willing to sit in his office and review patent filings while someone dismantled the whole thing from the inside because the mechanism for stopping it happened to be inconvenient. He stood up quietly and went to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the sink for a while looking at the dark yard. In the morning, he was going to call his personal attorney. He was going to have every risk laid out in plain language. He was going to look at this the same way he looked at any case, clearly, without sentiment, with full knowledge of what was at stake. And then he was going to make his choice. Ethan's personal attorney was a man named Tom Briggs, who had an office in Menlo Park above a dry cleaner and who had been doing estate and family law for 26 years. Ethan had found him 3 years ago when he was finalizing Sophie's custody arrangement, and he'd kept him on retainer ever since because Tom had the quality Ethan valued most in any professional. He told you the truth without softening it into something easier to swallow. Tom read the full package in 40 minutes while Ethan sat across from him and drank bad coffee from a machine in the waiting room that Tom had apparently never updated. When he was done, he set the papers down and looked at Ethan over the top of his reading glasses with the expression of a man preparing to say something his client wasn't going to enjoy. "Your bar license is the ceiling here," Tom said. "Everything else is manageable. The financial exposure is essentially zero if the arrangement is structured the way you're describing. No commingling, no shared assets, no financial instruments. The legal co-parenting declaration creates real parental rights, which is actually the part I want to talk about, but the career piece is what keeps me up at night on your behalf. Walk me through it." California state bar ethics rules prohibit an attorney from entering into a personal arrangement with a client that creates a conflict of interest or that a reasonable person could interpret as an attempt to gain personal advantage through legal manipulation. Tom took his glasses off. You're not her attorney of record on the governance matter. Marcus Chen is. Your IP. That separation helps. But you're a company attorney proposing a personal legal arrangement to the company's CEO for the purpose of satisfying a governance clause. That's the sentence that a disciplinary panel writes down. And if everything is disclosed, full transparency, independent oversight, external review, it's better. It's not bulletproof. Tom leaned back. Ethan, I've been practicing long enough to know that ethics complaints are easy to file and expensive to defend. Even if you win, and I think you would win, the process takes time, costs money, and creates noise you don't want around your career. He paused. I'm not telling you not to do it. I'm making sure you know what you're actually deciding. Ethan looked at the stack of papers on Tom's desk. His full case history with Viridian, the statutory analysis he'd written in his hotel suite 3 nights ago, the preliminary framework Marcus's team had sent over. He'd put all of it together in a folder that morning with the organized deliberateness he brought to every case file. He did it because organizing a problem was how he thought through it, not because he had any illusion about the outcome being tidy. How are Sophie's rights affected? He asked. Tom's expression shifted slightly, the practiced neutrality of a family lawyer engaging with the part of the conversation that actually mattered. The co-parenting declaration as drawn creates a legal co-parenting relationship between you and Vanessa Sterling. Not adoption, not full guardianship transfer, but it confers on her specific legal standing with respect to Sophie. The ability to make certain medical and educational decisions if you're unavailable, the right to pick her up from school, emergency contact status that carries legal weight. It's real. It has to be real, or it doesn't satisfy the clause. He set his glasses back on. What it means practically is that if the arrangement goes forward and then dissolves, when it dissolves, you need a termination framework that's just as detailed as the entry framework. And Sophie needs to not be significantly attached to Ms. Sterling, because terminating the legal relationship is complicated enough without a 7-year-old who doesn't understand why. Ethan was quiet for a moment. That's the thing keeping you up, Tom said. Yes. Good. That means you're thinking about this right. Tom picked up his pen. Here's what I recommend. We build the entry document with a termination clause that's specific and protective of Sophie's interests. We include a provision that she's not introduced to Ms. Sterling in any capacity that frames the relationship as parental during the arrangement period. You manage the boundary. And you have my office on call for the entire duration. Any document, any new development, you call before you sign. That works. And Ethan, Tom waited until he looked up. Make sure she understands what this costs you. Not in a negotiating way. Just make sure she actually knows. Vanessa had spent 36 hours sleeping approximately 4 of them. She'd been in back-to-back sessions with Marcus's team, with Diane Ashworth, with the 2 outside governance firms they'd quietly brought in, and with a compliance specialist named Reyes, who had the specific skill of looking at any legal structure and identifying its most uncomfortable load-bearing point. The picture they'd built together was complicated, but coherent. The structure existed. The precedent was thin, but real. The documentation would be extensive, exhaustive, and deliberately airtight. What it needed was Ethan Parker. She'd known that for 2 days. She'd been waiting to see if the legal review turned up an alternative, and it hadn't. On Thursday morning, she asked him to come to her office. He came at 10, on time, and she noticed he'd brought nothing with him. No laptop, no legal pad. He'd left the briefing materials behind, which she read as him having already decided. Your personal attorney cleared you? She asked. He advised me on risk. Ethan sat down across from her. That's different from clearing. What did he say? That my bar license is the part he's most concerned about. That if this gets challenged and goes to the ethics board, I win the case, but it's expensive and disruptive. That the co-parenting declaration creates real legal standing, not a fiction, and that I need to manage Sophie's experience of this carefully. He paused. He also said to make sure you understood what this costs me. Vanessa held that. I do understand. Okay? Do you trust that I do? He looked at her steadily, I think you're someone who understands costs in the abstract very well. I'm less sure about in the specific, but I'm willing to find out. It was the kind of thing that could have landed badly, depending on delivery, but it didn't. It landed like what it was, an honest answer from someone who wasn't going to manage her feelings at the expense of his own clarity. Then let me be specific, she said. If this goes wrong, if Richard mounts a successful ethics challenge and your license is at risk, I will provide full legal support. Not Viridian's legal support. Personal. My own resources outside the company structure. Attorney fees, expert witnesses, anything needed. That's a written commitment, not a verbal one, and it doesn't depend on the outcome of the board vote. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, I appreciate that. And Sophie, Vanessa paused. It felt important to get this right. I don't know your daughter. I'm not going to pretend I understand what it means to raise a child alone. But I will not let the arrangement create confusion or instability for her. Whatever boundaries you set around her experience of this, I'll follow them. Your call, completely. Ethan looked at his hands for a second, then back at her. She doesn't know anything yet. I'd like to keep it that way for as long as possible. Agreed. Another pause. Outside the window, Palo Alto was doing its Wednesday morning thing. Traffic, cyclists, the particular busyness of a town that ran on coffee and ambition. Neither of them looked at it. All right, Ethan said. Let's build it. What followed was 10 days of the most careful legal construction Vanessa had ever watched happen up close. Tom Briggs and Marcus Chen's team worked jointly, and what they produced was a document that Diane Ashworth later described as the most over-engineered personal legal arrangement I've ever reviewed, which is exactly what it needed to be. Every element was disclosed. Every financial relationship between Vanessa and Ethan, of which there was exactly one, his existing employment contract, was itemized and walled off from the arrangement. An independent ethics monitor, a retired judge named Patricia Holden, was engaged to review the process in real time and certify that no governance manipulation had occurred. They filed the formal declaration on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the retreat. Marcus sent the disclosure package to the full board simultaneously, 12 board members receiving an identical packet at 9 a.m., followed by a cover letter from Diane Ashworth explaining the legal basis, the statutory foundation, the compliance oversight, and the complete documentation trail. Vanessa was in her office when the emails started coming in. Most were brief acknowledgments. Some asked for clarifying calls. 2 were wordless, which she read as people processing. Richard Holloway's response came at 2:17 p.m. He didn't reply to the disclosure email. He called her directly. Vanessa, he said, in the tone of a man who had decided to be disappointed rather than hostile. I want to understand what you think you're doing here. I'm satisfying the clause, Richard. You're constructing a paper arrangement. It's a real legal instrument, filed, registered, reviewed by an independent ethics monitor, and fully disclosed to the board. You're welcome to have your own counsel review it. This is exactly the kind of maneuver. It's a legal solution to a legal provision. My father wrote Section 14C with a statutory reference that defines the requirement broadly. I've satisfied it within that definition. She kept her voice even. If you believe there's a problem with the structure, you bring it to the board. That's the process. A silence. This isn't over. I didn't think it was, she said. But I'd rather do this through the proper channels than have this conversation again. She hung up. Her hands were steady. She noticed that not because it was remarkable, but because there was a version of herself, younger, less practiced, who would have been shaking. The Richard Holloways of the world had tried to manage her out of her own company before. Not like this, not with this specific mechanism, but the underlying move was familiar. Find a structural vulnerability, apply pressure at the seam, and wait for something to crack. She was not cracking. Ethan's life had developed a strange new rhythm. His work hadn't changed. He was still running the IP department, still defending the trade secret case that had brought him into the governance documents in the first place, still doing the ordinary back and forth of patent review and case strategy that filled his calendar. But there was now a second layer. He and Vanessa had standing calls every 2 days, 15 to 30 minutes, reviewing compliance documentation, checking in with the ethics monitor, managing whatever new question had surfaced from the board. They weren't personal conversations. They were professional ones, organized and purposeful, but they had a particular quality to them that was different from any other professional relationship he had. There was no hierarchy to it. She called him Ethan. He called her Vanessa. They spoke to each other like two people solving a shared problem, which was exactly what they were. He found himself noticing things he hadn't registered before. The way she thought, fast but not sloppy, moving through multiple variables simultaneously without losing any of them. The way she handled uncertainty, which was not by pretending it didn't exist, but by mapping its edges and deciding what she could control within it. She was harder on herself than anyone around her seemed to realize. He caught it in the way she framed things. Not the board is worried about, but I didn't manage this well enough. He didn't mention it, but he noticed. One evening, about 2 weeks in, they were on one of their standing calls, and he was sitting in his car in the Viridian parking lot after a late meeting because Sophie was at a friend's house and he had nowhere urgent to be. Vanessa was somewhere in her building. He could hear the faint ambient quality of a large, quiet floor behind her. They'd worked through the compliance checklist. The call should have ended. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "How do you explain your schedule to Sophie, the late calls, the extra—" "I tell her work is busy," Ethan said. "She's 7. She knows work gets busy. She also knows when I'm stressed in a way I'm not telling her about." "Does she ask?" "She asked last week why I was eating standing at the counter instead of sitting down." A brief pause. "What did you say?" "I said I was thinking about something. She told me thinking worked better when you sat down." He heard Vanessa make a sound that was the beginning of a laugh before she caught it. "She's not wrong." "No," Vanessa said. "She's not." Another pause, different from the professional ones. "My father used to do that," Vanessa said. "Stand at the counter. My mother would tell him the same thing." She stopped. "I don't usually tell people that kind of thing." "You don't have to." "I know." A beat. "I'm trying to get better at it. Apparently, according to my last 2 executives, I have a trust deficit." "Meaning you don't trust people or people don't trust you?" "Meaning I don't let people know me well enough to trust me fully, which creates a distance that reads as—" They use words like calculating or difficult. Ethan was quiet for a second. "People who say difficult usually mean she doesn't make my life easier in the ways I want her to." "That's generous." "It's also just usually true." Vanessa was quiet. Outside his car window, the parking lot lights had come on, casting the kind of flat orange glow that made everything look slightly like a memory. "Go home, Ethan," she said. "Eat sitting down." He smiled at the windshield. "Night, Vanessa." He drove home. Tit. Richard had been on the phone with Gerald Tate every 3 days. The calls had gotten shorter as the news got less useful. The structure was holding. The independent ethics monitor had filed a preliminary certification that the arrangement was compliant, and 2 of the board members Richard had counted on were asking careful questions that suggested they were taking the documentation seriously. "What do we have?" Tate asked on a Thursday evening. "Nothing clean yet." Richard was at his kitchen island, tie loosened, reading through a folder his assistant had compiled. "The monitor is a problem. Patricia Holden is respected. Nobody's going to ignore her certification. So we go around it. We can't go around a retired judge's ethics certification without looking like we're attacking a retired judge's ethics certification. Then we go at the attorney." Richard looked up from the folder. "Parker. He's an IP lawyer filing a co-parenting declaration with the CEO of the company he works for. The bar complaint writes itself." "It does," Richard said carefully. "But Holloway's team has already disclosed everything. They've got oversight documentation, independent review, full transparency. A complaint gets filed, the bar looks at it, and if everything they've submitted is what they say it is—" "The process takes time," Tate said. "Even if Parker wins, it takes 3-4 months minimum. The board vote is in 3 weeks. He can't maintain the arrangement while under active investigation. His own ethics require him to step back from any matter where his conduct is under review." Richard was quiet for a moment. "File the complaint," Tate said. "Not you. Use someone external, someone who can credibly claim they reviewed the public disclosure documents and have a genuine concern. It doesn't have to win. It just has to slow everything down. And if Parker has to step back, the arrangement loses its legal foundation. The clause is unsatisfied, and we proceed with the vote. Richard looked at the folder again. He'd been in corporate governance for 30 years. He'd seen structures built and dismantled. He knew what he was being asked to do, and he knew that the framing Tate used, genuine concern, credible claim, was the part you said out loud so that the record showed you'd said it. What he also knew was that Ethan Parker was a single father with a 7-year-old daughter and a law license that had taken him years to build. He sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up the phone. Well, Ethan was reading a brief at his desk on a Friday afternoon when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. He answered on the 4th ring. Mr. Parker, this is James Whitfield from the State Bar's Office of Chief Trial Counsel. I'm calling to inform you that a formal complaint has been filed against you regarding your conduct in connection with a governance matter at Viridian Technologies. Ethan set the brief down. The complaint alleges that you entered into a personal legal arrangement with a corporate client for the purpose of manipulating corporate governance in violation of Rule 1.8 of the California Rules of Professional Conduct. Whitfield's voice was professional and completely neutral. I want to make you aware that as of today, the complaint is under initial review. You'll receive formal written notice within 5 business days. Can you tell me who filed it? The complainant's identity is part of the public record and will be in the written notice. I'm not in a position to tell you over the phone. Understood. Ethan's voice was steady. He registered distantly that he was gripping the phone harder than he needed to. Is there anything required of me at this stage? No action required at initial review. The written notice will detail next steps. A pause. Mr. Parker, I'm required to advise you to consult with personal counsel. I have personal counsel. Thank you. He hung up. He sat for maybe 30 seconds. His office window looked out over the atrium of the 6th floor, and he watched a colleague cross the space below without really seeing her. His mind was doing what it did when a case suddenly changed shape, running back through the structure, checking the load-bearing points, identifying where the pressure was now being applied. He'd known this was a possibility. Tom had told him clearly. He'd built it into his calculation. Knowing something is coming and having it arrive were different sensations, though. He'd built that into his calculation too, which was why he sat for 30 seconds and then picked up the phone and called Tom Briggs before he called anyone else. Tom answered and listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Okay, Tom said when Ethan was finished. Here's what we do. When Ethan finally called Vanessa 40 minutes later, he had a plan. He also had the specific concrete feeling in his chest of something that had been theoretical becoming real, settling into his body with the particular weight of a decision you've already made and now have to live with. She picked up on the first ring. I know, she said. Marcus just called me. Are you okay? He surprised himself slightly with the honesty of his answer. Not entirely, he said, but I'm okay enough. Let's figure out what we do next. The complaint made the rounds faster than Ethan had expected. He didn't know who leaked it. The bar's initial review process was supposed to be confidential until formal proceedings began. But by Monday morning, 2 days after Whitfield's call, Marcus Chen had forwarded him a message from a legal industry newsletter that had published a brief item about an ethics inquiry involving a Viridian Technologies attorney in connection with a disputed governance arrangement. No name. Enough detail that anyone inside the company would know exactly who it was about. Ethan read it at his kitchen counter before Sophie woke up. He read it twice, put his phone face down, and made her breakfast. She came down at 7:15 in the pajamas with the small yellow stars on them that she'd had since she was 5, and that were now about 2 inches too short. She sat at the table and ate her cereal and told him a complicated story about something that had happened at recess involving a disagreement about the rules of a game he didn't fully understand. He listened. He asked the right questions. He handed her the orange juice when she reached for it without looking away from her story. After he dropped her at school, he sat in the car for a moment in the drop-off line while other parents pulled away around him, and he let himself feel the thing he'd been keeping at a careful distance all weekend. Not fear exactly. More like the sensation of standing on ground that had been solid and now had some give to it. The kind of ground where you could still walk, but you'd be foolish to run. He drove to work. The atmosphere on the 6th floor was careful in the way that offices get when something has happened and everyone is deciding how to position themselves relative to it. 2 colleagues made a point of stopping by his office in the first hour. Supportive check-ins that were also, he understood, intelligence gathering about where things stood. He was polite and gave them nothing. One junior attorney on his team knocked and asked directly if there was anything she should know, and he told her honestly that the matter was being handled and her cases were unaffected. At 10, he went downstairs to Vanessa's floor. She was on a call when he arrived, visible through the glass wall of her office. Her assistant, a composed man named Jordan who had the specific skill of communicating volumes through small gestures, caught his eye and held up 2 fingers. Ethan sat in one of the waiting chairs and looked at the framed patent diagrams on the hallway wall, some of which he'd helped defend. After 4 minutes, Vanessa appeared at her office door and waved him in. She looked tired. Not the surface tired of a bad night, but the underneath tired of sustained pressure that hadn't let up. She'd done a reasonable job of keeping it off her face for the past 3 weeks, but this morning it was closer to the surface. "Close the door," she said. He did. "Patricia Holden is filing a supplementary certification today." Vanessa sat behind her desk. "It specifically addresses the ethics complaint and confirms that her monitoring process, which was documented from the start, establishes no basis for the manipulation allegation. We're attaching it to a response letter that Marcus and Tom are drafting jointly." "That's good. It helps. It doesn't end it." She looked at him. "How are you?" "I'm functioning." "That's not the same as okay." "No," he said. "It's not." She picked up a pen, turned it in her fingers, set it down. "I want to talk about what happens if the bar investigation extends past the board vote. Diane's legal opinion is that the arrangement remains valid during an active but unresolved investigation. The filing of a complaint doesn't automatically invalidate the declaration or your standing as a party to it. But Richard's team will argue otherwise. They'll push the board to treat an open investigation as a reason to hold the compliance question as unresolved. Ethan had already worked through this with Tom. The argument fails on the merits. An investigation that hasn't produced a finding can't be treated as a finding. Any attorney on that board knows that. Any attorney. Not every board member is an attorney. Then we make sure the ones who aren't understand the distinction before they walk into that room." Vanessa looked at him. "Marcus wants to brief every board member individually, 12 separate meetings in the next 2 weeks. He's asking if you're willing to be present for those meetings." Ethan thought about that. Sitting across from 12 board members, some of whom he'd never met, in the middle of an active ethics complaint, making the case for the legitimacy of an arrangement he'd helped design. "Yes. You're sure? If I sit out the briefings, it looks like I have something to hide. I don't have anything to hide. I'd rather be in the room." She nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll tell Marcus." She paused. "I also want to tell you something that isn't strategic and isn't about the case. I was at the company when your father wrote that clause." She stopped. "I'm sorry. That's not... I know this isn't about my history with the document. What I'm trying to say is..." She stopped again. He waited. "I don't take it lightly," she said finally. "What you're putting in the middle of this. I know what your career means. I know what your license means to your daughter's life. And I need you to know that I don't treat that as a line item in a risk calculation." She held his gaze. "It matters to me. You matter to me. Not because this arrangement needs you to, but because we've been doing this together for 3 weeks, and I know who you are now." The office was quiet. Through the glass wall, Jordan was managing something at his desk with careful efficiency. Ethan thought about what Tom had told him. Make sure she knows what this costs you. He'd taken that as a practical instruction. He understood now that it had also been, in its own way, a question about whether the person on the other side was someone worth the cost. "Thank you," he said, "for saying that directly. I'm trying to get better at it." He almost smiled. "I noticed." The board briefings began that week. Marcus ran them, with Ethan present and Diane Ashworth on call for any legal question that went beyond what they'd prepared for. They were careful, methodical sessions, 20 to 40 minutes each, walking every board member through the statutory basis, the compliance documentation, Patricia Holden's certifications, and the ethics complaint response. No spin, just the structure, laid out clearly with every supporting document available for review. Most members were professional. Some were genuinely curious. A few were clearly already decided and were attending out of procedural obligation. The ones Ethan watched most carefully were the two Richard had been working, Davis Yee and Carolyn Marsh. He'd seen them at the retreat, the 90-second conversation that Richard had planted something in. In their individual briefings, both of them asked sharper questions than the others. Not hostile exactly, but testing, looking for the load-bearing point in the structure to see if it held weight. Davis Yee asked the question Ethan had been expecting since the complaint was filed. Mr. Parker, let me be direct. You identified a legal mechanism, proposed it to the CEO, entered into a personal legal arrangement with her, and now you're under ethics review. From the outside, regardless of documentation, doesn't this look like exactly what the complaint says it is? The room was a small conference space in the Viridian Tower that Davis used when he was in Palo Alto. He'd brought his own counsel, a compact woman who'd said almost nothing but was writing everything down. Ethan looked at Davis and answered without rushing. I understand why it can look that way. The sequence of events, laid out without context, creates an uncomfortable picture. Here's what I'd ask you to look at instead. What did I gain? My employment terms haven't changed. I have no equity agreement, no financial interest in the company beyond my existing salary, no governance role, no path to any of those things through this arrangement. He paused. The co-parenting declaration gives me legal standing with respect to my daughter's care if I'm unavailable. That's it. That's the only thing I have now that I didn't have 3 weeks ago. If this is manipulation for personal gain, the personal gain is invisible. Davis Yee looked at his counsel. She made a small movement with her head. The ethics complaint, Davis said, was filed by a firm called Whitmore Legal Partners. Do you know who they represent? Ethan didn't. He kept his expression neutral. I don't. I did some research this morning. Davis looked at Marcus. Whitmore's principal client in enterprise technology is Meridian Capital Group. Their outside counsel relationship has been active for 4 years. He set down his notes. I want to understand who is actually driving this process. Marcus leaned forward. That's a question we've been working on, too. Marcus's investigative instincts were among the best Vanessa had seen in anyone who wasn't technically a private investigator. He had a researcher, a woman named Claire, who Vanessa had always thought was underutilized, who could trace corporate relationships through 6 layers of subsidiary and holding structure and come out the other side with something that looked like evidence. What Claire found over 3 days was a map. Meridian Capital Group had been quietly accumulating information about Viridian for 2 years. They had a research file, disclosed in a competitor intelligence lawsuit from an unrelated company, that specifically identified Viridian's patent portfolio as a primary acquisition target. Their thesis, documented in an internal memo that had become public through the lawsuit discovery process, valued the portfolio at north of $600 million in a breakup scenario, meaning acquire the company, strip the IP, sell to defense contractors and platform companies, exit. Richard Holloway had joined Viridian's board 14 months after that memo was written. Whitmore Legal Partners, who filed the bar complaint against Ethan, had been on Meridian's retainer for 4 years. None of it was direct. None of it was the kind of thing you could put in front of a judge as proof of a conspiracy. But assembled together, with Claire's sourcing attached, it told a story that was hard to read any other way. Vanessa read the research summary at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, sitting on her apartment floor because she'd started sitting on floors when she needed to think, and had never bothered to explain it to anyone. Her apartment was on the 14th floor of a building in San Jose, spare and functional, with a view she mostly used as a backdrop for thinking. She called Ethan. He answered after 2 rings, which meant he was awake, which meant he was probably doing the same thing she was, running through the same material in his head, mapping the same connections. You've seen the research summary, she said. Marcus sent it an hour ago. What do you think? A pause. Not uncertainty. Just him organizing. I think Richard didn't write Section 14C. Your father did, and your father probably had a genuine reason for it. Richard found a clause that existed, identified an opportunity in it, and built a play around it, which is different from manufacturing the thing from scratch, but it doesn't make the play less deliberate. Does it change the legal approach? Not directly. The ethics complaint is still what it is. We defend it on its merits. But what it changes is the board conversation. If we can show that the complaint was filed by a firm connected to Meridian, and Meridian has a documented acquisition interest in Viridian, then the complaint isn't just an ethics matter, it's part of a corporate takeover strategy. He paused. Davis Yee already started pulling that thread this morning. He's going to find it with or without us. Vanessa looked at the city lights outside the window. Richard is going to know we have this before the board meeting. Probably. He'll try to move first, do something to neutralize it before we can use it in the room. What would he do? She thought about it. Richard was methodical. He didn't improvise. If he moved, it would be through process. Another motion, another procedural maneuver, something that created delay or uncertainty. He might try to call an emergency session, move the vote up before we've had time to finish the board briefings. Ethan was quiet for a second. Can he do that? With 3 board members' signatures, he can call an emergency session with 72 hours' notice. She pulled her knees to her chest. I need to make sure he doesn't have 3 signatures. Who's his clearest ally besides the members he's already worked? Barton Pierce. He's been quiet through all of this, which is itself information. Barton is never quiet when he doesn't have a position. She rubbed her face. I need to talk to him directly, not through Marcus. Me. Tonight? Tomorrow morning. Early. She paused. You should get some sleep. You too. I will. She wouldn't, and they both knew it. Barton Pierce was 64 and ran a real estate technology fund out of Santa Barbara. He'd been on Viridian's board for 6 years, had always been collegial, and had the quality that Vanessa had both relied on and occasionally been frustrated by. He didn't take positions until he was certain, and he was rarely certain early. He was the board member who waited to see which way a room was going before he committed to a direction, which was a liability when you needed votes and an asset when the room was going your way. She called him at 7:30 in the morning. Vanessa, he said, with the warmth of someone who'd been expecting the call and was mildly relieved it had arrived. I was wondering when we'd talk. I'm going to ask you directly, Barton. Has Richard asked you to sign an emergency session request? A beat. He has. Did you? Not yet. Another pause. I want to hear you out first. I always said that. I'm going to ask you to hold off on signing anything until you've seen the full research summary Marcus is sending at 8 this morning, specifically the section on Whitmore Legal Partners and their relationship with Meridian Capital Group. Silence on the line. I think you'll find it relevant, she said. She gave him time to think. Barton was not a person you pushed. Send it, he said finally. I'll read it before I do anything. That's all I'm asking. She hung up. Across the city, things were moving in ways she could feel but not fully see. Board members reading documents, Richard managing his own conversations, Patricia Holden working through her supplementary filing, Tom Briggs building Ethan's defense response for the bar. All of it in motion simultaneously, all of it weighted against a vote that was now 11 days away. She went to the office. Oh shit. It was the following Thursday when things cracked open. Ethan had been in a patent review meeting when his phone buzzed with a message from Tom. Call me as soon as you're free. Good news, but complicated. He stepped out of the meeting, went to the stairwell, and called. The bar has completed initial review, Tom said. They're not moving to formal proceedings. Ethan leaned against the stairwell wall. Why not? Because Patricia Holden's supplementary certification was thorough enough that the initial reviewer couldn't find a basis for a formal hearing. Combined with the disclosure documentation and the fact that Whitmore's conflict, their Meridian connection, got flagged by the bar's own ethics division when they reviewed the complainant's standing. Tom paused. The complaint is closed at the initial stage. No formal proceedings, no findings, no record in your disciplinary history. Ethan breathed out slowly. You're not out of it completely, Tom said. Richard could refile through a different vehicle. But this specific complaint, the one they built the timeline around, is done. And more importantly, the bar issued a brief statement noting that the complaint appeared to have been filed by a party with a financial interest in the outcome of a corporate governance dispute. That language is going on the public record. The stairwell was concrete and fluorescent lit and smelled faintly of the building's HVAC system. Ethan stood in it and felt something release that had been wound tight for 3 weeks. "Tom," he said. "Yeah. Thank you." "You built a clean structure," Tom said. "I just defended it. Go tell Vanessa." He went upstairs. He didn't call ahead. He knocked on her office door and Jordan, reading his face, simply opened it without checking. Vanessa was at her desk reviewing something when he walked in. She looked up. He said it in one sentence. "The complaint is closed. No formal proceedings." She stared at him. Then she stood up, which she almost never did when someone came to her desk. She was usually the one who stayed seated, controlled the gravity of the room. She stood up, and for a moment she looked like someone who'd been bracing for something heavy and had just felt it lifted and didn't quite know how to stand without it. "Ethan." The bar flagged Whitmore's conflict publicly. It's in their statement. The Meridian connection is now part of the record in a document that has nothing to do with our team putting it there. Her hand was on the desk. He wasn't sure she knew it was. She was working through the implications the way he'd seen her work through everything, fast, sequential, the next move already forming while she was still processing the current one. "The board meeting is in 8 days, she said. "Yes." Richard walks into that room with no ethics complaint, a publicly flagged conflict in his strategy, and 12 board members who've all been briefed on the full structure. She looked at him. "We might actually win this." "We're going to win this," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer than the statement required. Something shifted in the room, subtle, and neither of them named it. The particular quality of two people who had been standing side by side in a hard thing and were only now, with the pressure briefly eased, turning to look at each other directly. "I'll call Marcus," she said. "I'll update Tom." They were both moving again, but something had changed quietly, the way things change when you're not watching for them, in the space between what needed to happen and what had. That evening, Ethan picked up Sophie from her after-school program, and they drove home through the early dark of a California November, the streetlights coming on one by one along the route he drove 5 times a week. She was talking about a science project, something involving a model of the solar system and a disagreement with her teacher about which planet was the most interesting. She had opinions. She always had opinions. He listened and drove and thought about what the next 8 days would look like, and under that he thought about what would happen after. The arrangement would either hold or it wouldn't. The company would survive or it wouldn't. And when it was over, when the legal structure dissolved as it was designed to, when the temporary co-parenting declaration was terminated in the orderly, documented, Sophie-protected way Tom had built into the agreement, he would go back to being exactly what he'd been before. An IP attorney with a clean bar record and a 7-year-old who thought Neptune was underrated. That was the plan. He pulled into the driveway. Sophie was out of the car before he'd shut the engine off, heading for the front door, still talking about planetary rings. "Dad," she called back without turning around, "do you think Neptune is interesting?" "I think it's seriously underrated," he said. She threw open the front door with the satisfaction of someone who'd just won an argument. He sat in the car for one more moment. 8 days. The 8 days passed the way the weeks before them had. In motion, always in motion, with no natural pause between one thing and the next. Marcus ran 2 more board briefings. Diane Ashworth filed a supplementary legal memorandum laying out the Meridian connection in language precise enough to be useful in any subsequent legal proceeding. Claire's research summary was distributed to every board member through official channels, properly sourced, carefully worded. Not an accusation, but a documented sequence of facts that any reasonable person could follow to an uncomfortable conclusion. Barton Pierce, to his credit, had read the full package within an hour of receiving it and had sent Marcus a 1-line email. "I won't be signing anything for Richard, not a declaration of loyalty to Vanessa, just a line in the sand, which was all she'd asked for." Richard, for his part, went quiet in a way that didn't read as retreat. It read as preparation. He submitted a formal rebuttal to the board 2 days before the meeting, a 20-page document that Vanessa read twice from cover to cover at her kitchen table on a Sunday evening with a glass of water she kept forgetting to drink. It was well written. She'd expected it to be. It challenged the statutory interpretation of Section 14C, argued that the co-parenting declaration was legally creative but substantively insufficient, and characterized the Meridian Research Summary as circumstantial and irrelevant to the governance question at hand. It didn't mention Ethan by name, which she found more unsettling than if it had. She called Ethan at 9 that night. "I've read it," he said before she could ask. He's not wrong that the statutory argument has some purchase. The 1987 statute cross-reference is legitimate, but the precedent is thin. There's no case law that applies it directly to a corporate governance clause of this type. Does that hurt us? It's the part I'd attack too, if I were him. But Diane's memo addresses it directly, and her argument is stronger than his. The weakness in his rebuttal isn't the legal analysis. It's that the legal analysis is the only thing in it. He's got 20 pages of why our structure is insufficient, and nothing addressing why a firm on Meridian's payroll filed a bar complaint against the attorney who built the structure. Because there's no good answer to that. Right. He left it out because anything he says about it makes it worse. Vanessa pushed her chair back from the table. Her apartment was quiet in the way it got late on Sundays. The building's ambient sound settling, the city outside doing its insomniac hum. She'd lived alone for 3 years and mostly didn't think about it. Tonight she was slightly more aware of it than usual. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" she asked. A brief pause. "I've been in courtrooms with less preparation than this." "Yes." "That's not exactly what I asked." Another pause, different from the first. "I keep thinking about the moment they call for the vote," he said. "After everything else, all the documentation, the briefings, the compliance filings, Diane's memo, Claire's research, it still comes down to a show of hands in a room. And some of those hands belong to people I've never met, who are deciding in the last 30 seconds. He was quiet for a moment. "So, ready in the professional sense. In the human sense, I'll let you know when it's over." She understood that completely. "I'll see you at 8, she said. 8, he confirmed. She sat at the table after hanging up for longer than she needed to, looking at Richard's 20-page rebuttal spread across the kitchen table. She'd built this company out of worse situations than this. She kept telling herself that, and it kept being true, and it kept not being quite enough to make tomorrow feel manageable. She gathered the pages, stacked them, and went to bed. She slept badly, which she'd expected, and was dressed and out the door by 6:45, which she'd also expected. The board meeting was held in Meridian's 14th floor conference room, a large, deliberately neutral space that Vanessa had designed for exactly this kind of gathering. Long table, 12 chairs for board members, additional seating along the wall for council and staff. The room had good light, which she appreciated, and good acoustics, which mattered because she intended to be heard clearly. She arrived at 7:50. Ethan was already there, at the far end of the room with Marcus and Diane, reviewing something on a laptop in the low-key way of people who have been preparing for a thing so long that the actual event almost feels anticlimactic. He looked up when she came in and gave her a brief nod, the kind that said, "ready," without any of the words. Board members arrived in ones and twos over the next 40 minutes. Most greeted her. A few had the careful, uncommitted affect of people who hadn't entirely decided how to vote and didn't want their body language to give anything away. Davis Yee came in alone, poured himself coffee, and sat down without talking to anyone, which she read as deliberate neutrality. Carolyn Marsh arrived with her own counsel seated behind her. Noted. Richard came in at 8:48, 12 minutes before the scheduled start. He was with 2 people she didn't recognize, one with the look of a litigator, one with the look of a financial analyst. He didn't look at Vanessa when he entered. He looked at the room. She watched him do it, the quick, methodical read of an experienced operator checking his board position. Whatever he saw or didn't see, his expression didn't change. He sat down at the far side of the table. At 9 o'clock, Vanessa called the meeting to order. She'd run hundreds of board meetings. She knew the rhythm of them, the particular pacing that kept a room from going sideways, the moments when you spoke, and the moments when you let silence do work. Today's structure was straightforward. Opening procedural matters, then Vanessa's presentation of the Section 14C compliance case, then Richard's rebuttal presentation, then open board discussion, then the vote. She'd been in rooms like this before. She'd never been in this room with this much writing on it. "Thank you all for being here," she said. "Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this meeting covers a governance matter with significant implications for the company, and I want everyone in this room to have full confidence that the process is being conducted with complete transparency. Independent legal oversight has been maintained throughout, and all materials before you today have been reviewed by outside counsel." Richard's expression didn't change. He was very good at that. She walked through the compliance case methodically. The statutory basis, the documentation trail, Patricia Holden's certifications, the complete financial disclosure, Ethan's employment terms, unchanged, no equity arrangements, no financial instruments of any kind between them. The co-parenting declaration itself, real and registered and legally operative in the way the statute required. She spoke for 22 minutes without notes, because she knew the material cold, and because reading from a document in this room would signal uncertainty she didn't have. When she finished, she nodded to Richard. He stood. He had the relaxed posture of someone who wasn't physically intimidated by a room, and he spoke well. Clear sentences, organized structure. The voice of someone who'd made presentations like this many times. He walked through his statutory challenge. He characterized the 1987 cross-reference as a creative but ultimately insufficient reading of the clause's intent. He argued that the spirit of Section 14C, leadership stability through genuine partnership, was not satisfied by a legally constructed arrangement between an employer and employee. Then he paused, and Vanessa knew from the pause that he was about to go somewhere else. "I want to address something that wasn't in my written rebuttal," Richard said, "because it developed in the past 72 hours. I have been made aware that a research summary distributed to this board by Viridian's legal team makes implications about my motivations in bringing this governance matter forward. It suggests a connection between the ethics complaint filed against Mr. Parker and a third-party capital group." He looked around the table with the measured calm of someone who'd rehearsed this. "I want to be direct with this board. I have no financial relationship with Meridian Capital Group. I have never been compensated by them, directed by them, or communicated with them about Viridian. Any suggestion to the contrary is without foundation." He sat down. The room was quiet. Vanessa looked at Marcus, who gave her a small nod. She stood again. "I'd like to respond to that directly," she said. "The research summary doesn't claim that Mr. Holloway has a direct financial relationship with Meridian Capital Group. It documents that the firm which filed the bar complaint against Mr. Parker, Whitmore Legal Partners, has a 4-year active retainer relationship with Meridian Capital Group, and that Meridian has a documented acquisition interest in Viridian's patent portfolio that predates Mr. Holloway's appointment to this board." She paused. "I'm not characterizing Mr. Holloway's motivations. I'm asking this board to consider the sequence of events and decide what they indicate." She sat down. Davis Yee spoke first from the board side. "I want to ask a procedural question. The ethics complaint against Mr. Parker. The bar has issued a closure statement. Is that correct?" "Correct," Marcus said. "The complaint was closed at initial review. The bar's public statement notes that the complaint was filed by a party with a financial interest in the outcome of a corporate governance dispute. And the complainant was Whitmore Legal Partners." "Yes." Davis looked at Richard. "Richard, I'm going to give you the opportunity to respond to that specifically. Not the research summary generally, the bar's own language, a party with a financial interest. What do you want to tell this board about that?" Richard met his eyes. "I'm not responsible for who filed that complaint. I didn't direct Whitmore's actions." "Did you know Whitmore had a relationship with Meridian before the complaint was filed?" A half-second pause. In a deposition, Vanessa thought, that half-second would be in the transcript. "I was aware of Whitmore's client relationships in the general sense as part of the broader legal community. I didn't coordinate the filing of that complaint." Davis Yee wrote something on his notepad. Carolyn Marsh leaned forward. "Vanessa, I want to ask you something. If the board votes to reject the compliance determination, If we find that the co-parenting structure doesn't satisfy 14C, what happens to Mr. Parker, practically? His employment is unaffected by the board's governance determination, Vanessa said. The arrangement dissolves and he returns to his existing role and contract. But his career, the publicity, the public record of an ethics complaint, even if it was closed. Carolyn. Ethan spoke from the wall. He'd been seated there throughout, behind the board table, in his designated position as legal staff. He spoke quietly, but the room caught it. May I address the board directly? Vanessa nodded. Please. He stood. He didn't have anything in his hands. The ethics complaint was closed without a finding. The bar's own statement created a public record that the complaint was filed by a conflicted party. That record protects my professional standing more than a complaint that was never filed would have. He paused. I'm not asking this board to consider what this cost me. I'm asking you to consider what it tells you about the nature of the challenge you're being asked to vote on. Someone used the bar complaint as a strategy to delay this process. The bar identified that and said so publicly. I'd like this board to ask why that strategy was deployed against this specific legal arrangement at this specific moment. He sat back down. The room was quiet again. Different quiet than before. Barton Pierce had said nothing for the entire meeting. He was a man who rarely spoke in large gatherings, preferring to talk in small groups, where his words had more precise landing surfaces. Now he looked up from his notepad. I've been on this board for 6 years, he said. I've watched Vanessa run this company through a market correction, 2 acquisition attempts, a regulatory challenge in 3 states, and a talent crisis that would have broken most organizations I know. She has never once in 6 years asked me to take something on faith. He looked at Richard. This process, the documentation, the compliance oversight, the independent monitor, it's not the work of someone trying to game a clause. It's the work of someone trying to do it right. He set his pen down. I'm voting to certify compliance. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatic. Nobody moved or made a sound. But Vanessa felt it. The moment when a room's weight tips. Richard knew it too. She could see it in the way he recalibrated slightly, the set of his shoulders changing by a degree that only someone watching for it would catch. The board discussion continued for another 40 minutes. 2 more members spoke in favor of certification. One asked a technical question about the termination provisions in the co-parenting declaration that Diane answered cleanly. Richard spoke once more, a composed and competent defense of his position, but the tone of it was different now, arguing to the record rather than to the room. When Marcus called for the vote, Vanessa's hands were flat on the table in front of her. She wasn't gripping anything. She'd made a decision sometime in the past hour that she wasn't going to perform composure. She was just going to be still and let the room do what it was going to do. The vote was 9-3 in favor of certifying compliance with Section 14C. Richard's 2 reliable supporters had held. Carolyn Marsh, in the end, had voted with Vanessa. Davis Yee had voted with Vanessa. Barton Pierce had voted with Vanessa. It was over. Not the meeting. There were procedural matters, a formal record of the decision, next steps with the governance documentation. Those took another 20 minutes. But the thing itself was over, and everyone in the room knew it the moment the count was announced. Richard sat through the remainder of the meeting with the particular stillness of a man deciding how to conduct himself in defeat. He didn't storm out. He didn't make a scene. He signed the required documentation when it reached him. When the meeting closed, he stood, exchanged brief words with his counsel, and left the room without speaking to Vanessa. She let him go. The room cleared gradually. Board members stopped to speak with her. Brief, warm exchanges that had the quality of attention releasing. Marcus was at the end of the table compiling documents with the focused relief of someone who'd been carrying something heavy for 6 weeks. Diane Ashworth was on her phone already, which Vanessa suspected meant she was billing. Ethan was at the window. He'd stayed while the others moved around him, standing at the 14th floor glass with his hands in his pockets, looking at Palo Alto doing its mid-morning routine below. She crossed the room and stood beside him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The city was just the city, cars and cyclists and the flat California light that made everything look slightly more real than it needed to. 9 to 3, she said. Yeah. How do you feel? He thought about it. Actually thought about it, which she'd come to recognize as a characteristic thing he did. He didn't give you the reflexive answer, like I need to sleep for about 12 hours and then figure out what normal feels like again. That sounds accurate. He turned from the window and looked at her. You were good in there. You knew exactly when to speak and when to stop. That's harder than people think. I've had practice. I know, but it still takes nerve. A pause. The moment Barton spoke, did you know he was going to? I hoped. I didn't know. She looked back at the city. He's a man who makes up his mind slowly and then doesn't move. I just needed him to make it up the right way. He watched you for 6 years, Ethan said. That's what he said. People who watch you eventually see who you are. She wasn't sure what to do with that exactly, so she let it sit. Outside, a plane was making its slow arc toward SFO, catching light for a second before it disappeared into the white of the sky. The dissolution paperwork, she said. 90 days from today per the termination clause. Yes. Tom's office handles it. Yes. He was looking at her now, and she knew she was looking at him, and they were both doing the thing they'd been doing for the past few weeks, without quite acknowledging, finding the shape of something they didn't yet have a name for. Ethan. She turned to face him. After the 90 days, when the arrangement is formally over and the governance period is closed, I want to have dinner with you. Not a legal call, not a compliance review. Dinner with no agenda attached to it. He looked at her for a moment. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite surprise. More like a man checking to make sure he was hearing what he thought he was hearing. Dinner, he said. Yes. As in I'd like to see who you are when we're not in a crisis. Because I've liked who you are in a crisis, and that makes me curious. He was quiet for a second. She registered that she was not entirely comfortable waiting for his answer, which was itself unusual. My daughter will want to know where I'm going, he said. What will you tell her? Probably that I'm having dinner with someone from work. A small pause. She'll ask if it's a friend. What will you say? I'll say yes, he said. I'll say it's a friend. The word landed between them with more weight than its size suggested. Vanessa felt the corner of her mouth move. 90 days, she said. 90 days, he confirmed. Marcus appeared at the edge of the room. Sorry to interrupt. The press office is asking how we want to handle the disclosure statement. Also Richard's board seat. Technically, he's still a member until... I know. Vanessa turned from the window. Give me 5 minutes. Marcus retreated. She looked at Ethan one more time. He had the particular expression of a man who was going to go back to his office now and do his regular work and think about something else entirely for the rest of the day, not because he wanted to, but because that was the kind of person he was. Thank you, she said, for all of it. He nodded. Not the small professional nod he'd given her at 8 this morning, but something fuller. Go run your company, he said. She went. No. The afternoon was operational. Statements to prepare, a call with the communications team about the press release, a conversation with outside counsel about Richard's board tenure and what the governance documents required in terms of formal process. She moved through it with the particular efficiency that came after a sustained high-pressure period when the pressure finally eased. Not relaxed efficiency, but efficient efficiency, the kind where you know exactly what needs to happen and your mind isn't divided. Richard submitted his board resignation by email at 2:15. No explanation, no courtesy call. Just a formal letter addressed to the full board, clean and brief, thanking the company for the opportunity and citing personal reasons for his decision to step down effective immediately. She read it once and gave it to Marcus to file. That evening, Vanessa went back to the office after everyone else had left. She did this sometimes, not to work exactly, but to be in the space when it was empty and let herself feel what had happened. The 6th floor was quiet, the cleaning crew long gone, the building's overnight systems doing their low hum. She walked through the open floor plan with its clean lines and California light that was just the ambient glow of Palo Alto streetlights now, coming through all that honest glass. 400 people worked here, 400 people whose jobs, whose projects, whose years of built work had been sitting behind this vote without knowing it. The patents in the portfolio, some of which Ethan had defended in federal court, were still here, intact, not parceled out to contractors who would use them in ways Marcus Sterling had never imagined when he wrote the documents that had started all of this. She stood at the window on the east side of the building where you could see a particular angle of the valley. Not beautiful exactly, more like familiar in the specific way of something that's been yours for a long time. Her father had built something and put it in her hands. She'd taken it from 12 people to 400. She'd fought for it in rooms where people thought she was too young, too female, too new, not enough of whatever the room had decided it needed. She'd won those fights because she was better prepared and because she understood what was actually at stake. Today she'd won one of those fights because a man she'd known for 6 weeks had read a document and found something nobody else found and had stood in front of an ethics investigation with his bar license on the line and hadn't flinched. She didn't have a clean way to think about that yet. She was still working on it. She turned off the light she'd turned on and walked back to the elevator. 90 days. In Redwood City, Ethan was helping Sophie finish her solar system model at the kitchen table. It was made of foam balls and paint and wire and had been in progress for 2 weeks, and tonight it was finally taking the shape of something that resembled what it was supposed to be. Sophie had very specific opinions about which planet was which color and had corrected him twice on the relative size of Jupiter. "Neptune is still the most interesting," she said, painting the foam ball with a careful small brush. "You've decided this permanently." "I decided it 2 weeks ago. It's permanent." He watched her work. She had paint on her left hand in 3 colors, which she hadn't noticed and he wasn't going to mention yet. The kitchen table had the specific comfortable disaster of a project reaching its final stage. He thought about the boardroom, about 9 to 3, about Vanessa at the window saying 90 days with the particular directness that was her specific mode of courage. Not dramatic, not rehearsed, just clear. He thought about what came after. He didn't know exactly. He knew it was something, and knowing it was something was enough for tonight. "Dad," Sophie said without looking up, "is everything okay now? With work?" He looked at her. She was still painting, focused on Neptune, not watching him. "Yeah," he said. "Everything's okay." "Good." She held Neptune up to the light, checking the color. "I figured it was." "You've been sitting down at dinner again." He looked at the table. "She notices," Mrs. Kowalski had told him once. "Kids always notice." He reached over and picked up the brush for Mars. "All right," he said. "Move over. Let me do the red one." The 90 days didn't feel like 90 days. They felt like a season, something with weather and texture and small events that accumulated into something larger than any single one of them. The governance period wound down quietly. Patricia Holden filed her final certification in week 11, a clean document that confirmed full compliance with Section 14C and closed the independent oversight process with no outstanding issues. Marcus sent Vanessa a brief message when it arrived. "Done. Clean record, full stop." She read it at her desk and felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief, exactly. Something more like the particular stillness that comes after you've been bracing for a long time, and the thing you were bracing against has finally, completely passed. The company continued. The Seattle expansion moved into build phase. The enterprise client pipeline that had been discussed at the Carmel retreat closed 2 major contracts in October. The patent portfolio, the spine of everything Marcus Sterling had started and Vanessa had defended, was intact, and the team that had built it was still here, still working, still producing. 400 people who'd never known how close it came. Ethan went back to being the IP attorney. He ran his department, managed his cases, defended 2 new patent matters that landed on his desk in October and November. The bar complaint was a closed record with a protective public notation. His colleagues, most of whom had never fully understood what had happened, treated him with a slightly warmer regard that told him the broad strokes had circulated anyway. He didn't explain anything. He just kept working. But the 2 of them had been on calls twice a week for 3 months, and calls don't end the day the governance period does. They taper. Or they don't. Theirs didn't taper. The compliance reviews stopped. The calls didn't. They migrated from structured professional check-ins into something less defined. Conversations that started with a work question and stayed on the line for an hour, ranging through things neither of them had particularly planned to say. She told him about the early years of Viridian, the specific texture of trying to run her father's company while being young enough that vendors sometimes assumed she was a junior employee. He told her about the year Sophie was 3 and her mother left, and how he'd sat in his car outside the apartment at 2 in the morning trying to figure out what competent single parenting looked like at 31 hours of no sleep. Neither of them was performing anything. That was the quality of it that he'd come to recognize. The absence of performance, the particular ease of a conversation where neither party was managing the other's impression. He found that rarer than he'd previously understood. The 90 days ended on a Tuesday. Tom Briggs's office sent the dissolution paperwork at 9 a.m. Ethan read it at his desk and signed his copies before lunch. Vanessa signed hers the same morning. The legal co-parenting declaration was formally terminated at 2:15 p.m., registered, archived, done. Sophie's rights and protections were unaffected. Her life was exactly what it had been before, which was the entire point. Tom called him at 3. "All clean," Tom said. "You know what I'm going to say." "I know. I said it at the beginning. If it goes anywhere, make sure the boundaries are clear. Employment relationship still exists." "I know, Tom. I'm not your ethics advisor. I'm your personal attorney. So this is just me talking to you like a person. I read people for a living. That woman is not someone who does things carelessly." A pause. "That's all I've got. That's more than you usually give? Don't make me regret it." Ethan put his phone down and looked at his office for a moment. The neat shelves of case files, the small framed photo of Sophie at the beach that sat on the corner of his desk, the California light coming through the window at the angle that meant it was mid-afternoon. He'd sat in this office for 4 years. It looked the same as it always had. He was not the same as he always had been, which was interesting to sit with. He picked up his phone again and sent Vanessa a text. "Paperwork's filed. You free tonight?" Her reply came in 4 minutes. "Yes?" 7. "The Italian place on California Avenue. I've already made the reservation." He stared at that for a second and then smiled at his phone screen like an idiot, which was fine because nobody was watching. The Italian place was the kind of restaurant that had been in Palo Alto for 20 years without feeling like an institution, worn in the way of places that didn't spend money on updating what didn't need to be updated. Red checkered tablecloths that nobody was self-conscious about. Bread that arrived without asking. A wine list that wasn't trying to be impressive. Vanessa had been here twice in her 20s and had forgotten about it, and then remembered it specifically for tonight, which she took as information about what she wanted the evening to feel like. She got there first. She was almost always early, which she'd spent years framing as professional discipline and had recently started acknowledging was anxiety wearing a productive disguise. She ordered sparkling water and looked at the menu she'd already decided on and watched the door. He came in at 7:03. He changed from work clothes, dark jacket, no tie, the slightly deliberate casual of someone who'd thought about what to wear without wanting to look like they'd thought about it. He saw her immediately and crossed the room with the same directness he brought to everything. No scanning, no hesitation. "Hi," he said, sitting down. "Hi." They looked at each other across the checkered tablecloth for a moment. There was a particular comedy to it that they both felt. All those phone calls, all those conference rooms, all that crisis and pressure and careful documentation. And here they were at a table with bread and a candle, looking like two people on a first date, which was essentially what this was. "This is strange," she said. "Incredibly," he agreed. "I've spoken to you for approximately 300 hours in the past 4 months. And I still don't know how you take your coffee." "Black?" she said. "Of course." He picked up the menu. "I take mine with too much sugar, which my daughter considers a character flaw." "She's not wrong. She never is, which is exhausting." The waiter came. They ordered without the performance of deliberation. Both of them were people who made decisions quickly and had already read the menu. When the waiter left, the conversation found its own level the way it always did, settling into something comfortable without effort. She told him about her week. He told her about a case that had turned complicated in a way that was professionally interesting and personally inconvenient. They talked about the Seattle expansion, then veered into a discussion about a book she'd been reading that he'd also read 2 years ago, and they disagreed about the ending in the specific, energized way that book disagreements can go when both people have thought carefully about why they're right. It was, she thought, the most enjoyable dinner she'd had in longer than she could easily calculate. Not because anything extraordinary happened, because nothing was performed. She was used to dinners where some part of her was always running the room, reading the other person's agenda, managing the impression, staying 3 moves ahead. Tonight, she wasn't doing any of that. She was just sitting at a checkered tablecloth, eating good pasta and talking to someone who didn't require management. That was not as small a thing as it sounded. Halfway through the main course, he set his fork down and looked at her in the way that meant he was going to say something real. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Okay." "Back in October, the night we found out the complaint was closed, you said I mattered to you, not because the arrangement needed me to." She remembered saying it exactly. "Yes." "Did you mean that as... Did you already know what you were feeling then? Or was that just..." "I knew," she said. "I didn't know what to do with it, because the timing was what it was, and the situation was what it was, but I knew." A pause. "I don't usually say things I'm uncertain about. I've noticed that. Is that a problem?" He thought about it. The actual deliberation, not a rhetorical pause. "No. It's one of the things I like about you. I always know where I stand." "Where do you stand?" He looked at her steadily. "I've been trying to figure out how to ask you to have dinner with me since approximately the 3rd week of September, and the arrangement made that impossible. And the 90 days felt like the longest 90 days of my life. That's where I stand." She felt something warm settle into her chest. Not the dramatic flood of a movie moment, just the quiet arrival of something right. "For the record," she said, "I made this reservation 2 weeks ago." He laughed. It was a real one, unguarded, shorter than a performed laugh, and she filed it as something she wanted to hear again. They walked after dinner. The November evening was cool in the specific Northern California way. Not biting, just present enough to make you aware of it. California Avenue at 9 p.m. had the pleasant irrelevance of a street that's finished its busy part of the day and is now just existing. They walked without deciding to, falling into the same direction without discussion. The kind of thing that happens when 2 people are comfortable enough in each other's presence that movement doesn't require negotiation. She told him something she hadn't told many people. That the year after her father died, when she was running Viridian on barely enough sleep and not nearly enough experience, she'd had a period of about 4 months where she genuinely believed she was going to lose the company. Not to Richard Holloway or a board maneuver, just to her own insufficiency, to the gap between who she was and who the job required. She'd told no one. She'd kept moving. She'd closed the gap the only way she knew how, which was by working and learning and refusing to stop. But it had cost her something, and what it had cost her was the ability to let people close enough to see the gap. It was easier to be impressive at a distance than to be real up close. He listened without interrupting. "The thing about this whole mess with 14C," she said, "is that I couldn't do it alone. I couldn't be impressive from a distance and make it work. I needed someone in the room with me. And you were in the room with me in a way that nobody has been in a long time." He was quiet for a moment. The street was quiet. A car passed. "You weren't always easy to be in the room with," he said. "I know. The first 2 weeks, I wasn't sure you actually trusted me. I thought you trusted the structure I built, which is different." "It is different." She looked at the sidewalk. "I came around." "You did." A pause. "I watched you come around. That's when it happened for me, if I'm being honest. Not when you described the stakes or when you offered to cover my legal fees. When you started calling me just to think out loud, that's when I knew that you were actually letting me in." She didn't say anything for a moment. The street went on. The evening air was doing its mild California thing. "I'm better at letting people in than I used to be," she said. "My last exec wasn't wrong. I have a trust deficit. I've been working on it." "You're working on it well. Don't grade me." "I'm not grading you. I'm just..." He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him, standing on the sidewalk with the streetlight behind him and his hands in his jacket pockets and that particular quality he had of being entirely present, not somewhere else in his head, just here. I'm telling you I see it, that you're trying, that it matters. He paused. That's all. She looked at him for a moment. Then she closed the 3 feet between them and kissed him. Not tentative, not the careful first kiss of people who aren't sure. Just her, clear about what she wanted, in the direct way she'd been clear about things her entire adult life. His hands came out of his pockets. When they separated, the November air was exactly the same temperature it had been 30 seconds ago, and California Avenue was exactly the same street, and she felt exactly like herself, which was the best possible way to feel. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They started walking again. So, he told Sophie 2 weeks later. He'd been turning over the question of when and how for the entire interim, not because he was ashamed of anything, but because 7-year-olds process information in non-linear ways, and he wanted to have language ready for whatever came up. He told her on a Saturday morning while they were making pancakes, which was their weekend ritual, and which he'd chosen because the kitchen was a room where difficult things sometimes went easier than they did in more formal settings. He told her simply that he'd met someone he liked, that her name was Vanessa, that she was someone from work who had become a friend and was now something more. Sophie listened while pouring batter with complete focus, the way she focused on things she was going to have opinions about later. She was quiet for a moment. Is she nice? She asked. Yes. Like actually nice or grown-up nice? He considered that distinction. Both, I think. She's direct. She says what she means. I like that, Sophie said. People who don't say what they mean are confusing. They are. Another pause. The pancakes bubbled on the griddle. Does she know about me? Sophie asked. Yes, she's known about you since the beginning. Sophie flipped a pancake. She had inherited his precision at spatial tasks and her mother's stubbornness about methods. She refused to use a spatula smaller than a certain size. Okay, she said. You can tell her I said hi. He stood at the stove with his own spatula and felt something private and uncomplicated that he didn't try to name. I'll tell her, he said. When he relayed this to Vanessa later that day, she laughed, a genuine one, not the managed half laugh he'd heard her use in professional settings. She laughed and said, I said hi back, and then was quiet for a second and said, she sounds like a reasonable person. She's the most reasonable person I know, he said. She's also 7, so it comes and goes. That's honest. She insists on honesty. I didn't have a choice. They took it at the pace it wanted to go, which was not dramatic and not slow. They had dinner twice more in November and once at his house in early December. The first time Vanessa had been to Redwood City, to the bungalow with the oak trees that Sophie loved, and she walked through it with the quiet attention of someone reading something carefully. The narrow hallway. The kitchen table still faintly paint-stained from the solar system project. Sophie's drawings on the refrigerator, one of which was Neptune, recognizably blue-green even in crayon. She stood in front of the refrigerator for a moment. Neptune, she said. She'll explain the whole thing to you if you ask, Ethan said from the kitchen. Fair warning, she has strong feelings. So do I about Neptune, as it happens. You're joking. I'm absolutely not. It has the most interesting atmospheric chemistry in the solar system. He leaned in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. Do not lead with that when you meet her. I will not be responsible for the conversation. She turned from the refrigerator with the expression of a woman who had just decided to absolutely lead with that when she met her. They met for the first time properly on a Saturday in December, which Sophie had been told about in advance and which she had processed with the specific seriousness of a child who takes scheduling seriously. Vanessa came to the house. Ethan had made lunch, auto, the unpretentious kind, sandwiches and fruit, because he didn't want to create an event out of it, and he knew his daughter well enough to know that events made her perform rather than be herself. Sophie came downstairs in her Saturday clothes, which were not the clothes she would have chosen for a formal meeting, but were the clothes she was comfortable in, and Ethan had specifically not suggested she change. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Vanessa with the measuring gaze of a child who is deciding something. Vanessa looked back at her. She didn't crouch down or use the particular softened voice some adults used with children. The one that signaled, however well-intentioned, "I am adjusting myself for you." She just looked at Sophie the way she looked at anyone she was meeting for the first time. "Hi," she said. "I'm Vanessa. Your dad tells me you have opinions about Neptune." Sophie's measuring gaze shifted into something more interested. "He told you about that?" "He said you had strong feelings and warned me not to bring it up." Sophie looked at her father. "And you brought it up anyway?" "I did not," Vanessa said. "I just told you he warned me not to." Sophie thought about the logic of this for a second, found it reasonable, and sat down at the table. "Neptune is the most interesting planet," she said, in the tone of someone opening a familiar argument. "It has supersonic winds and a storm that's been going on longer than anyone's been watching it, and the color is actually caused by methane in the atmosphere." Vanessa sat down across from her. "The Great Dark Spot." Sophie stared. "You know about the Great Dark Spot?" "It's a storm system that Voyager 2 photographed in 1989. It disappeared and then a new one formed in the Northern Hemisphere." "Most people don't know that," Sophie said. "This was the highest form of compliment available in her currency." Ethan brought sandwiches to the table and sat down and watched his daughter and the woman he was falling in love with argue about atmospheric chemistry with the mutual intensity of two people who had finally found someone worth arguing with. And he thought that there were things in life you could not have anticipated, and this was one of them, and that being unable to anticipate a thing didn't make it less real when it arrived. Lunch ran long. Sophie forgot she'd been nervous. December moved into January. Vanessa and Ethan found the ordinary rhythm of two people who are building something without announcing that they're building it. The accumulated small decisions that don't feel like decisions in the moment, but that, assembled together, constitute a shape. He met a few of her people. She met a few of his. They had the argument about the book ending a second time and reached a different conclusion, which they both found more satisfying than agreeing from the start. She learned how he took his coffee. He learned that she had a specific and entirely non-negotiable position on the correct way to make scrambled eggs, which he thought was wrong, but didn't argue because some positions aren't worth challenging. She learned what it looked like to watch someone be a good parent. It was not what she'd expected. Not the performed warmth of the version that showed up in movies, not the effortful patience of someone trying to be something. It was quieter than that. It was helping with homework without taking over the homework. It was knowing when Sophie needed company and when she needed to be left alone with a book. It was the particular fluency of two people who had been working out how to coexist in the same space for 7 years, and had mostly figured it out, with occasional renegotiations as the 7-year-old became, incrementally, someone with more opinions and more ground she considered her own. Vanessa watched it and understood gradually that Ethan Parker was not defined by his capability at work, or by his willingness to put his career on the line for something he believed in, or by the quality of his mind under pressure. Though all of those things were true. He was defined by the consistent, unglamorous, frequently inconvenient fact of showing up for the same person every day. That was the thing. That was the one that changed something in her chest. She was 30 years old, and she had built a company and defended it, and survived things that were supposed to break her. She had never, until this year, understood what it felt like to be seen by someone who wasn't trying to get something from what they saw. Not approval, not access, not the strategic advantage of proximity to power. Just her. The actual texture of her, including the parts that were still rough and the distances she was still learning to close. It was uncomfortable sometimes. She was not someone who handled vulnerability easily or gracefully. She said the wrong thing occasionally, and he told her when she did, not unkindly but directly, in the way she'd asked to be treated when she said she was trying to get better. She had to learn to receive that. She was still learning, but she was learning. The 6-month mark fell in late March, a Thursday, which had no particular significance except that Vanessa noticed it while reviewing her calendar and found herself sitting quietly with it for a few minutes. 6 months since the Carmel retreat. 6 months since she'd stood on the deck with cold coffee and read an email that told her everything she'd built was at risk. 6 months since she'd had a conversation at 8 in the evening with an IP attorney who brought her a legal pad and a solution and looked her in the eye and told her exactly who he was. She thought about the version of herself in that hotel suite, holding the legal pad, reading Ethan's organized handwriting, the Pacific doing its thing outside in the dark. She'd been calculating then. She was always calculating. She was trying to figure out whether the structure was real, whether the person was reliable, whether the cost made sense against the potential outcome. She hadn't been calculating when she asked him to dinner. That was the difference. That was the thing she'd been slowly, imperfectly, incompletely working toward. The ability to act from something other than the next 3 moves. Viridian's Q1 results came in that week. Strong across every line. The patent portfolio had produced 2 new licensing agreements. The Seattle operation had its first 100 employees. The company her father had started and she had inherited and nearly lost and fought back was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, producing real work, employing real people, building something that hadn't existed before. She called her mother that Thursday evening, which she didn't do often enough and knew it. Her mother was 61 and lived in Sacramento and still had the same kitchen table where Vanessa had sat and done homework while her father stood at the counter thinking about things he didn't say out loud. They talked for 40 minutes, which was longer than usual. Her mother asked about work. She told her it was good. Her mother asked about her life with the specific, careful tone of a parent who has learned not to push directly. Vanessa told her about Ethan, not all of it. The broad strokes. Someone she'd met through work. Someone she'd been getting to know. Her mother was quiet in the listening way. "Is he good to you?" her mother asked. The question was so simple that Vanessa almost deflected it with something more complicated. Instead, she thought about it honestly, about the phone calls and the difficult conversations and the way he told her the truth when she needed it, and the way he'd stood in a boardroom when he didn't have to, and the way he looked at his daughter, and the way he looked at her. "Yes," she said. "He's good to me." Her mother said, "That's enough. That's actually everything." The dissolution papers were filed. The governance period was documented and archived. The board elected a new member to fill Richard's seat in February, a woman named Sandra Obuya, who ran an infrastructure technology fund and who had, in her first board meeting, asked a question about the IP portfolio strategy that made Ethan involuntarily sit up straighter in his chair, which Vanessa noticed and noted. Richard Holloway, as far as anyone could track, had moved on to other board positions and said nothing publicly about Viridian. Gerald Tate's Meridian Capital Group had moved on to other targets. The specific, carefully orchestrated threat that had been pointed at Viridian for 6 weeks in the fall had dissolved, as most threats do, the moment it failed. It had not left the company unchanged, though. The board was tighter, the governance documentation was more thorough, and the compliance function that Patricia Holden's oversight had effectively audited was now structured differently, better. The attack had been real, and it had prompted things that should have existed already. That was something Vanessa thought about occasionally. The unwanted gifts that hard situations left behind. She'd learned things about her own company that she hadn't known. She'd built a working relationship with a judge, an outside governance litigator, and a compliance framework that was now genuinely robust. She'd found out who her board members were under pressure, which was more useful information than any amount of normal operation could have produced. And she had learned, at not insignificant personal cost, that the greatest risk she'd been carrying wasn't Section 14C or Richard Holloway or Meridian Capital Group. The greatest risk was the distance she kept between herself and anyone who might matter. That was the real vulnerability. Everything else was manageable if you had someone in the room. She was working on closing that distance. She was imperfect at it. She would remain imperfect at it. But she was working on it. On the last Saturday in March, Ethan and Sophie drove to Vanessa's apartment for the first time. Sophie had requested to see it specifically because she wanted to know if Vanessa had any books about planets, which Ethan had told her was not a guaranteed feature of other people's apartments. Sophie had found this position difficult to defend. Vanessa had, in fact, 3 books with significant planetary content, one of which was a photography book about the outer solar system that a friend had given her years ago and that she'd kept more for the images than the text. She retrieved it from the shelf when Sophie came in, handed it over without ceremony, and Sophie sat down on the apartment floor and opened it with the focused seriousness of a researcher, which was how she read things she cared about. Ethan stood in the apartment and looked at Vanessa. She was watching Sophie on the floor with an expression that was careful and warm and slightly unguarded in a way he'd seen her allow herself more frequently over the past few months. The relaxing of the control she carried, not because she'd become less capable, but because she'd decided incrementally that not every room required every defense. "She's going to talk to you about that book for the next 45 minutes, he said quietly. "I know." She didn't look away from Sophie. "I cleared the afternoon." He looked at her. She turned to look at him. "You cleared the afternoon," he said. "I did. For a 7-year-old to explain a book you already own back to you. She probably knows things I don't." He laughed. The real one. She'd come to consider it something she kept a running account of, the real laughs she'd earned. "Sophie," he said. She didn't look up from the book. "Sophie." "What?" Still reading. "Tell Vanessa the thing about the supersonic winds." Sophie looked up. She held up the book, open to a full-page image of Neptune's atmosphere, deep blue and churning and indifferent. "The winds go up to 2,000 kilometers per hour, she said. "That's faster than anything on any other planet. And the sun is so far away that it barely provides any heat, but Neptune radiates more heat internally than it receives, and nobody knows exactly why." She looked at Vanessa. "That part is the most interesting part. Things that generate their own heat." The apartment was quiet for a moment. Vanessa looked at Sophie, then at Ethan, then back at Sophie. "I agree," she said. "That's the most interesting part." Sophie returned to the book. Ethan looked at Vanessa with the specific expression of a man who had watched something he'd hoped for arrive and was choosing not to make a production of it. She reached over and briefly took his hand. He held it. Outside the apartment windows, the last Saturday in March was doing what California Saturdays do. Unhurried and golden, moving at its own pace, uninterested in whether the people inside were ready for it. There is something that gets said about people who succeed, the way their stories get told in retrospect. The struggle is dramatized, the resolution is clean, the lesson is delivered neatly at the end like a package with the correct address. It makes for a satisfying shape. It is not, generally, how any of it actually works. What actually happened was messier and more uncertain and more human than any clean narrative can hold. A woman who had spent a decade defending her own walls finally had a reason to question whether all of them were necessary. A man who had built his life around a single clear priority, his daughter, her stability, her future, found that the architecture of that life had room for something he hadn't drawn into the plans. A 7-year-old who had grown up understanding that her family was exactly two people learned that two could expand without either member of the original equation being diminished. None of it arrived fully formed. All of it had edges. Vanessa still had days where the old reflexes ran ahead of her intentions, where she closed off before she meant to, or said something from behind the wall rather than in front of it, and had to go back and correct it. Ethan still had the specific exhaustion of a person running a department and raising a child simultaneously, and there were weeks where he had less to give than he wanted to. Sophie still had the complicated feelings of a child navigating a world that her parents had built without her input, and sometimes those feelings were easy, and sometimes they required patience from everyone. But the thing they were building together, the three of them slowly, without an official document certifying it, was real. It had the weight of things that are real. It had the specific gravity of chosen connections, which are different from the ones you're born into, in that you have to make the choice again, continuously, with full knowledge of the cost and the inconvenience and the ways the other person will invariably disappoint you. They kept making it. 6 months after the board vote, Viridian Technologies posted its strongest quarterly results since Vanessa had taken the helm. The patents were intact, the people were still there. The company her father had started in a smaller building with fewer windows was still producing things that hadn't existed before, which was the only measure she'd ever trusted. Richard Holloway's name appeared once more in Vanessa's peripheral awareness, in a trade publication piece about a restructuring at a different technology company where he'd joined the board. She read the headline, registered it, and moved on. Some people stayed in your life, and some people were part of a period of it, and the period had ended, and she had the particular equanimity about that of someone who had come out the other side carrying something worth more than what the threat had cost. Patricia Holden sent her a card in March. a small handwritten note, not a formal communication. It said that in 30 years of oversight and legal work, the Viridian matter was among the handful she was glad to have been part of. Vanessa kept the card in her desk drawer without quite knowing why, and understood later that it was because it represented something specific. The moment when doing something right and doing something that worked had been the same thing. Those moments were worth keeping. Tom Briggs sent Ethan a bill in February and a bottle of wine he'd never asked for in March, which was Tom's version of a review. Ethan drank the wine over 2 evenings with Vanessa and told her what each thing on Tom's desk had looked like when he sat there reading the bad coffee machine case summary on the morning this whole thing started. She asked questions. He answered them. They were still learning the shape of each other's histories, the rooms they'd been in before they'd been in the same rooms together. Sophie finished the solar system model. She brought it to school and her teacher gave the class more than the expected time for her presentation because Sophie had opinions, and the teacher was the kind of person who could recognize when a student had actually thought about something. She got the grade she'd decided she deserved, which was the only outcome she'd considered. On a Sunday in early April, Sophie was in the backyard of the Redwood City bungalow doing something elaborate with chalk that she declined to explain. Ethan was in the kitchen. Vanessa was sitting on the back porch steps with a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, watching the oak trees do whatever oak trees do on April mornings in California, which is essentially just exist with the slow confidence of things that have been in one place long enough not to need to prove anything. Sophie looked up from her chalk work and regarded Vanessa with the specific evaluative gaze she used when she was checking something against a prior assessment. "You always look like you're thinking about something," she said. "I usually am," Vanessa said. "What are you thinking about right now?" Vanessa looked at the oak trees, then at Sophie. "Whether to make my coffee at home in the mornings or whether I can keep coming here for it." Sophie considered this with appropriate seriousness. "We have a good coffee maker," she said. "Dad got it last year. It's the kind with the grinder." "I know. I've used it." "So you should probably just come here." "That's a reasonable position." "Oh, I have a lot of reasonable positions," Sophie said, and returned to her chalk. Ethan appeared at the porch door with his own coffee and looked at Vanessa on the steps, and at Sophie in the yard, and at the April morning being the particular kind of ordinary that doesn't announce itself as valuable while it's happening. He sat down next to her on the steps. She leaned slightly into him, not dramatically, just the small adjustment of someone who has decided, without making a statement about it, that this is a place they can lean. The oak trees didn't do anything. The morning continued. Sophie's chalk work revealed itself, slowly, to be another planet. This one large and blue-green, with ambitious swirling lines indicating atmospheric activity that no 7-year-old should technically know about. It was Neptune, obviously. Things that generate their own heat, Sophie had said. Vanessa understood that now in ways she hadn't before. The year had cost her something, and given her something, and the math of it came out positive. Not clean, not without residue, but positive. She had learned the specific courage of letting herself be known. She had found, improbably, in the middle of the hardest fight her company had ever made her wage, a person whose integrity she trusted and whose presence made her life feel larger than it had been. That was not a thing she had planned for. She was glad for it anyway. The morning held them, all 3 of them, the oak trees, the chalk Neptune still taking shape, and didn't ask anything of any of them except to stay, which all of them did, each in their own way, for exactly as long as the morning lasted.